Today I want to talk about That Night by Chevy Stevens. It is a thriller suspense type novel where they tell you who the killer is before the story rolls out, and somehow still the ending is a surprise. So I thought it was really neat, and I hope that you enjoy the synopsis of it. So the back of the book says, 18-year-old Toni and her boyfriend Ryan were convicted of the murder of her younger sister. 17 years later, Toni's out on parole and back in her hometown, but she's struggling to adjust to a new life on the outside. Ryan is convinced he can uncover the truth, her mother doesn't believe Toni's innocent, and the former high school girls who made Toni's life miserable may have darker secrets than anyone can imagine. Before Toni can move forward, she must take the terrifying step back into her past to find out the truth about that night. The format of this book was interesting. It was a time jump sort of situation where you had the very first chapter is Toni being released from prison and immediately introduces the bitterness and resentment that she had at being wrongfully convicted. It tells you right up front she didn't kill her sister. And then for roughly the first 2/3 of the book, you're jumping back and forth between the year that ended in her sister's murder and her time in prison. So it basically time-lapsed 17 years over several chapters. And it talks about how angry she was when she first got there because she hadn't actually done anything. And how nobody would believe her because she was kind of a screw-up. And she kind of got railroaded by the system. Basically, they didn't even bother to look for anybody else. And none of this is spoilers, by the way. This is all right up front on the back of the book and in the very first chapter. So I don't feel like I'm spoiling anything in the story for you. When I do start getting into spoilers, of course, I'll warn you about that. So it kind of jumps back and forth between this bitter, hardened woman who's spent literally half of her life in prison and this senior in high school who's, yes, she's making some poor choices and yes, she's messing up, but she's not really a criminal or hard or anything like that. She's just a teenage girl who's in love with a boy from the wrong side of the tracks and her parents don't like it, so everybody assumes the worst, right? And she kind of smokes a lot, so in the 80s and 90s that meant you were on drugs, even though now it's kind of socially acceptable to do so in moderation. Probably not for teenagers still, but the stigma of it has reduced significantly with the legalization of it. That's not me condoning anybody doing any of that. It's just a statement of the changing culture, or an observation of the changing culture. So she gets out, and she tries to start her life, right? Before she went in, she worked for a guy named Mike who owned a fish restaurant on the coast, on the lake, on the coast. And she gets a job as a cook because she'd worked in the kitchens in prison, so she has quite a bit of experience. Before she'd been waitressing, now she can work in the back because she doesn't want to really be in front of a bunch of people because she doesn't want to be ogled at, and he doesn't really want her in front of a bunch of people because, you know, the whole town knows she's a convicted murderer. It's a small town. So she gets a job in the back of the house, and this teenage girl sort of takes a liking to her. She's a little goth, and she's complaining about how overbearing her mother is. And Toni's just like, yo, kid, I have problems of my own. I don't need to be invested in yours. And you don't really want to be taking life advice from somebody who just got out of prison. Like, that's not a good move. But she saw a lot of herself and her relationship with her mother, which had been antagonistic basically her whole life, but really ramped up as she sort of matured and came into her own and started wanting to make decisions for herself and started wanting a little more freedom as she grew up. And then her mother just was not ready to relinquish control. She just wasn't ready to let this child turn into a young woman, to become an adult. She wasn't ready for her not to be a child anymore. So her mother was trying to control her, and the harder her mom tried to control her, the harder Toni bucked against her mom. And that's pretty typical. That, you know, I think most of us who were teenage girls or who have raised teenage girls have experienced something similar. I know I certainly had my fair share of bucking against my parents just for the purpose of bucking against my parents. So, so Toni gets a job in the back of the house. This teenager sort of latches onto her. And we kind of go back and forth between her trying to make a life in her hometown where she was born and raised and her family still lives, her mom and dad still live, and her sister was killed and everybody there knows she's a killer. Why she chose to go back there, I don't know. It was necessary for the story. I understand that it was necessary for the story, but there wasn't any reason for her to have gone back there. Anybody with any sense would have tried to make a clean start somewhere else. Felons have a hard enough time functioning as it is. They struggle to get housing. They struggle to get employment. They struggle for people to trust them. They struggle to make friends. And everybody's like, well, you served your debt to society, go make a life now, and then we take away all the tools with which people build lives. It's a very strange situation. So Tony's kind of experiencing that, and she winds up, staying on a boat with a guy who doesn't really care, and getting a job with a guy who knew her before and didn't really believe that she was a killer. Or at least didn't believe that she was as vicious as everyone made her out to be. Even if she had participated in her sister's death, he didn't believe that it was vicious, that it potentially could have been an accident or something. He gives her a lot of leeway as a human being, and he's really the only one who does. Everybody else just kind of believes that she did it because she was a bad kid. She and her boyfriend broke into a neighbor's house and had a little drinking party. They didn't damage anything. They didn't destroy anything. They didn't steal anything. They just wanted some privacy, and couldn't get it at home. And, I found the first roughly half of the book, where every other chapter was a pretty deep analysis of the turmoil in 17-year-old Tony's life and the struggle that she was having at school and with her parents and her peers, and the bullying that she was experiencing, and the difficulties with her parents not understanding her and not being willing to try to understand her. I found that really difficult to read. It was probably a little too close to home for me, and that's probably why it made me so uncomfortable. So yeah, that's not to say it wasn't well written, or it may have been a little too well written. That may be why I struggled so much with it. But I had a hard time with that, which is kind of a weird thing to say. I read a lot of books with a lot of violence and a lot of gore and a lot of really outrageous things perpetrated against really innocent people, and all of that sort of washes off of me. But this particular thing was really hard. I don't know why. So this is where we're going to start getting into spoilery territory. I'm not going to reveal the end of the novel, because unlike Verity, it doesn't end on a cliffhanger. It doesn't end on a did she, didn't she, will they, won't they. It's a very clear ending of what happened, and it tells you exactly how her sister died and why her sister died. And I feel like it would detract from the book if I said what happened at the end, but I want to talk about the plot a little bit and sort of how the book progressed. So if you are really sensitive to spoilers, just go ahead and use the timestamps below to skip past the plot summary. I always label everything real big with the word spoiler, so it's super easy to skip around. But before we carry on, if you would please take the time to like the video and subscribe to my channel. It really means a lot to do that for me. I know it seems like a small, silly thing, but it helps me tremendously and it helps other people find the videos. It makes sure that YouTube knows that there are people who actually want to watch the stuff that I make, which is really useful. So if you've already done that, thank you so much for taking the time. Okay, on to the rest of the plot of the book. So Tony gets out of jail. She is working at this restaurant. She's living on a boat. And she's tried to see her parents. Her mom is absolutely unforgiving. She genuinely believes that Tony viciously murdered her younger sister. Her dad thinks she actually killed her, but is willing to forgive her. It's his only living daughter. He wants a relationship with her, but the mom gets in the way. We find out as things progress that the goth teenage girl from work, from her restaurant that she works at, is the daughter of the lead bully, like the mean girl bully, from high school. So shortly after this woman shows up, Tony calls her parole officer and it was like, hey, I just want to let you know I ran into this person. I had problems with them before I went into prison. I feel like they are going to try to make problems for me. What do you want me to do? And the lady goes, you're going to have to switch jobs. You can't work there anymore. Like, if you know that there's going to be problems, you can't afford to allow these problems to manifest. You need to get a different job. So reluctantly, because Tony loves where she's working, she talks to the guy who owns the restaurant. The guy moves her to a different place. And then a week later, a bunch of money goes missing from the safe overnight. Now, Tony wasn't there, and she had already handed in her key, but one of the sets of keys from the night shift had gone missing after she had moved. So because she's the only ex-con, and the wife of the guy who owns the restaurant didn't like her or didn't like that she was around, Tony got blamed for it, like you do. And it's very clear, the book makes it very clear that we all know that it's this Regina George character. I can't remember her name, but it's basically Regina George. So Tony gets fired. The boss reluctantly lets her go. He doesn't really have a choice. He can't have people thinking that he's letting his employees rob him, and his wife is furious. Even though she knows that she was set up, she can't prove it. She has no way to prove it. There's no security cameras or anything. So the boss fires her, and first thing she does is call her parole officer and let her know what's going on, because, you know, theft is a parole violation. And she's like, look, I didn't do this. This is what happened. And the lady goes, you know, you got to come in. Like, you need to come see me. We're going to have to sort this out. I may have to temporarily put you back in prison while all this gets investigated. While all of that was going on, Ryan, the boyfriend who got arrested with Tony, he had been sending her love letters basically the first few years that they were in prison, and Tony just didn't answer him. They'd been in prison for 17 years, and the first thing he did when he got out was find her. Now, if you don't know, parolees cannot associate with other convicted felons, so it was a violation of their parole. Hi, Jack. It was a violation of their parole for them to see each other, but he was still in love with her, and once she started thinking about it, she had to admit to herself that she was still in love with him too, but she just couldn't afford to be with him. The price was too much for them to go and spend literally the rest of their lives in prison for violating their parole. So she's trying to tell him, like, stay away from me. I don't want to go back to jail. I don't want you to go back to jail. Just stay away from me. And he's like, no, we need to find out what happened to your sister. We need to clear our names. We're never going to be able to have a real life here or anywhere else. You know, the life that we deserve if we're convicted felons. Like, we need to clear our names. And she's like, no, I just want to get over this. I want to get on with it. I want to live my life. Leave me alone. He doesn't stop. So while Tony's burying her head in the sand, Ryan is looking into what happened to Nicole, which is Tony's sister. And he finds one of the pack of mean girls who has become heavily addicted to narcotics and is sort of babbling when she gets a fix or when she gets high about how she knows a secret and she can't tell because it would ruin everyone's lives, and just really heavily indicating that she and the rest of the mean girls had something to do with Nicole's death, Tony's sister's death. And so Ryan starts kind of pursuing this and talking to the people who knew her and the people who had been close to her after, and sort of how she wound up on this downward spiral. And word sort of gets around, and the cop who investigated the original crime and who had originally interviewed them, interrogated them, and ultimately arrested them and had them sent to prison, kind of comes back around and threatens Tony and says, you know, I'm hearing things. You need to quit poking around with this. You know you can't be messing with these people. It's a violation of your parole. Like, you can't go and harass and intimidate these people who were witnesses in your trial. It's illegal. And Tony's like, I'm not doing anything. What are you talking about? Well, it was Ryan. But they can't find Ryan. And so word's starting to get around that this girl, that one of the Mean Girl Squad, was talking to people about this thing that happened 17 years ago. And then all of a sudden she turns up dead. Same way that Nicole died, which was very violent and very obviously murder. So of course, when this witness turns up dead, despite the fact that the trial's already gone on and everything, it looks retaliatory. So Tony and Ryan get rearrested, and not charged with the crime, but basically while the investigation is ongoing, they arrest them because they're basically holding them because they are the assumed guilty parties. So they're back in prison for a couple months, and you know, Tony's best friend in jail dies. You know, the woman who basically mothered her the whole time she was there, because she was really, she was really messed up, not just because she was wrongfully convicted of a brutal murder of her sister, but also because of this terrible relationship she had with her mom. And it sort of stunted her development because her mom was so controlling. It didn't really let her grow up. And it didn't allow her to become progressively more responsible like you're supposed to as a teenager, because her mom was constantly trying to control everything. So she was too busy pushing back against her mom, and there was no leeway for her to develop herself or her own sense of responsibility. So she wound up kind of doing that in prison under the gentle tutelage of this convicted murderer woman. So Toni gets beat up by some of the folks in prison who think that she snitched on somebody while she was out because somebody else got in trouble or something like that. I can't remember what it was. One of the girls from the halfway house basically got busted for something, and she assumed that Toni snitched because Toni had seen her dealing drugs. She didn't, by the way. She got caught on her own. But, you know, once you get labeled as a snitch, that's kind of it. So Toni got beat up pretty bad. And, you know, these women who were her friends in prison kind of look after her and take care of her and protect her. And she's there for a couple months while they're sort of doing this investigation, and they couldn't find anything to tie her and Ryan to the crime. So once they get out of this like 2-month hold when they're back in prison, immediately once they get back to town, Toni's finally like, this isn't going to stop. She's never going to leave me alone. Because we know that she's responsible for killing Nicole. This is the Regina George girl. She's not going to stop until we're either dead or back in prison permanently. So either we have to prove that she did this, or we're going to have to accept the fact that our lives are over. This is it. This is all we ever get. And they weren't ready to accept that. So they go ahead and pursue it. There is never any question in the book that these mean girls were responsible for the sister's death. There's never any question that is what happened. You just don't know how or why. And it all sort of rolls out in the last few pages. And normally I don't like endings that just sort of like spill out all of the information and then stop. This worked for this book. You find out who killed Nicole specifically, which one of them did it, how they did it, and why it happened. And then you find out how the police got it so wrong and why their investigation was so flawed and why these two young teenagers wound up in prison for half of their lives. And it all makes sense, and it's all very satisfying at the end to sort of like wrap itself up. It is not a happy ending, I will tell you that. The book does not gloss over the fact that these people's lives were ruined. The book does not gloss over the fact that corruption occurred or that half of their lives were taken away from them. They'll never get it back. They will never be okay. You know, whatever restitution the state makes to them, it will never make up for the fact that their lives were taken away from them. You know, that they went into prison as teenagers, as basically barely graduated from high school, and they came out in their mid-30s and they missed all of that life, and they'll never get it back. And it doesn't gloss over that. It doesn't hide from that. It doesn't try to make it feel happy. But it is very satisfying. It is a very satisfying ending. So here's a few of the things that I thought were well done in the book. The characters were complex and interesting. The personality that Toni was given felt like an actual person that was... Her mentality as a teenager was very believable. When you were reading the teenage chapters, it felt like something that a teenager would write. It felt like teenage feelings, teenage emotions, all that intensity and that anger at the world. And then her chapters as an adult, where you're sort of watching her harden in prison, and she goes from this scared, almost barely beyond being a child, to this grown woman who's experienced this horrible tragedy, completely outside of her control. This was done to her. It wasn't something she did. It's all very believable. The characters feel like real people having real natural reactions to things. I will say that the Regina George character felt a little over the top. She's definitely got some megalomania going on, and there's definitely some ego issues going on. her ability to get away with things felt a little too much, and her confidence in her ability to get away with things felt a little too much. But I have a feeling that's more because I've never experienced somebody like that who did not get caught. I have met people like that who just think that they can do whatever they want, and they, you know, because of their parents' influence or their money or whatever, they just, you know, they're basically bulletproof. I've certainly interacted with people like that, and I've also watched people like that fall. But I'm aware that that's not what happens all the time. You know, it's all over the media, and, you know, how much do you trust the media, right? But we know that there are people who perpetrate crimes that get swept under the rug, slap on the wrist, covered up, glossed over because of their position in society, be it that they're very wealthy or they're very prestigious or whatever. So we know that those people exist, even if we've never met them. So I suppose that it's reasonable that an ego that outsized would exist within a person who had been sheltered from consequences their whole life. Yeah, so that was the only part that was sort of a little bit of a stretch for me, was the outrageous things that this Regina George character did, and sort of her ability to get away with it unquestioned by anyone else just because of who she was. As for the rest of it, it was engaging. It kept me interested. It was a book that, when I put it down to go and do something else, I was thinking about it and wanted to go back and read more. So that's generally a good sign. So that's really all I have to say about it. It was interesting and engaging. It wasn't a stick to the rib sort of book. Like, it's not going to stay with me for years or anything like that. But I certainly enjoyed reading it. It was a heck of a ride. I really appreciated that the characters didn't get a happy ending, that it was a very hard look at the impact of wrongful incarceration and what it can do to people, that it was a hard look at how shelter and privilege and not being held accountable for the things that you do, or not having to bear the consequences for the actions that you take, can damage a person to the point that they just start acting like a lunatic and doing things that no reasonable human would ever do. And that is a form of damaging someone, is by just letting them get away with things. You know, so I appreciated the, hey, Eddie, stop. Hey, stop. So I appreciated that it didn't shy away from those things, and it didn't try to make everything okay at the end. Yeah, the murder got solved, but it still wasn't happy. It was still just kind of a, okay, I'm glad that that's over. I'm glad that that got done. Now everything's broken. And it just kind of left it there, and that was okay. That was the right ending for the book. So, yeah, I appreciate the grittiness of it and the reality of it, rather than everything being tied up in a neat bow at the end. So, yeah, That Night by Chevy Stevens, I really enjoyed it, and if you like thrillers or suspense novels, you'll probably enjoy it too. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and of course, if you like the way that I present information, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell down below. You can find all of my social media contacts in the description, and of course, if you want to keep up with me and the progress I'm making on my current novel, you can do that at effywritesbooks.com. Thank you so much for watching, have an excellent day, and I'll see you next time.